What if Robb Stark never attended the Red Wedding? What if a single word, spoken in terror by a man who expected to die, could unmake the most careful trap in the history of the Seven Kingdoms? What if the whole bloody arithmetic of a war turned not on a battle, but on a scout who talked too much in the dark? The northern host lay camped along the swollen banks of the Green Fork, tents pale as bone in the drizzling gloom, campfires guttering under a sky that would not stop weeping. The twins stood 2 miles distant, twin towers joined by a bridge of stone, and beyond that bridge waited a wedding meant to mend an old and festering insult. Robb Stark slept, or tried to, while his men made ready to cross. And in a tent near the horse lines, a captured Frey scout sat with his wrists bound and his eyes fixed on the great gray wolf that watched him from the shadows, unblinking, patient as hunger. They had taken him hours before, riding too close, too curious, and now Grey Wind's handlers had brought him low without ever laying a blade against his skin. It was the wolf that broke him. The wolf, and the silence, and the certainty growing in his belly that these Northmen already knew something he had sworn to keep. So he offered pieces of it, hoping to buy his life with them. Lord Walder writes to Casterly Rock. He said, the words tumbling loose. Lord Walder writes, and receives answers, and the answers come sealed in Lannister crimson, and there is armor in the cellars. Black armor, bolts of it, mail and plate, for men who are not yet there. Word of it reached Robb's tent within the hour, and he came awake fully at the first sentence, the way commanders learn to. He listened without speaking. He let the man talk, himself hoarse. Black armor hidden beneath a castle where 5,000 of Robb's men were meant to feast unarmored, drunk on guest-right and Frey wine. He turned the fact over in his mind, the way a man turns a coin he suspects is counterfeit, testing the weight of it, and he did not like the weight at all. He summoned his mother. He summoned the Great John, whose bulk filled the tent flap like a storm cloud, and Mage Mormont, who came with her mace at her hip, as though she had never truly taken it off. They gathered around a table lit by a single lamp, and Robb laid the scout's words before them plainly, without ornament. The Great John wanted to storm the place. That was his way, all fury and forward motion, and Robb loved him for it and could not afford it. Maeg was quieter, weighing men against walls, counting the cost of a bridge that could be held by a handful against a host. But it was Catelyn who spoke the thing that mattered, and she spoke it with the certainty of a woman who had known Walder Frey since girlhood, who had watched his sour pride curdle over decades of slights real and imagined. The danger is not the wedding, she said. The danger is arriving at all. Walder Frey does not forgive. He has waited half his life to be owed something by a Stark and a Tully both, and now he is owed an apology. And men like him do not want apologies. They want the pleasure of refusing them. If Tywin Lannister has offered him the chance to break guest right and call it justice, he will take it, and he will smile while he takes it. Robb heard her. He heard the murder of an ancient custom being weighed against an insult already given, and he understood that no possible courtesy could now close the gap. To ride into the twins was to gamble every man he had on the honor of a man who had none. To refuse the wedding outright was to hand Tywin the fracture he wanted, the crumbling of the North's last great alliance. There was no clean path. There was only the least ruinous one. Send Edmure alone, Catelyn urged. Send him with Sir Brynden, with an honor guard and nothing more. Let the wedding proceed. Let the vows be spoken. Let Walder have his ceremony and his pride restored. But keep the host outside those walls. Keep it whole. Keep it armed. Robb was silent for a long moment. Grey Wind had come to stand beside him, and his hand fell to the fur of the wolf's neck without his thinking on it, and he felt the low, steady breath of the animal against his palm. He thought of the black armor in the cellars. He thought of men who would put it on. He made his choice. If you're enjoying this alternate history of Westeros so far, please consider subscribing, as I upload new stories every single day. Now, let's continue with the story. "Let it be said that I have taken a fever," he told them, "sudden and severe enough to keep me abed. It is no dishonor for a sick man to send his uncle in his place. Edmure will wed, Sir Brynden will stand for our house, and the escort will be small enough to give no offense. The rest of us remain here." He looked at the Greatjon, at Mage, and his voice hardened into iron. "But the men will sleep in their mail tonight. The horses stay saddled. If a raven flies from that castle, or a horn sounds, or a single scream carries across that water, I want this host mounted and moving before the echo dies." He does not finish the thought aloud. He does not need to. Inside the twins, the feast unfolded exactly as treachery required it to unfold. The trestle tables groaned beneath bread and salt and honeyed wine, and the fiddlers played their careless tunes, and Edmure Tully sat beside his new-made bride, with the flush of a wedding still upon him. Lord Walder Frey presided over it all from his high seat, a shriveled old man wrapped in ermine, his sunken eyes moving from face to face along the northern ranks with the patient satisfaction of a spider counting the flies in his web. He was waiting. He was always waiting. And what he waited for was a signal he had rehearsed in his heart 100 times, a song that would tell his men the guest right they had offered was already broken. Consider the strategy from Walder Frey's perspective, and it holds a terrible elegance. Fill the hall with wine until the northerners are heavy and slow. Bar the doors when the moment comes. Loose the crossbows from the galleries. Kill the king in the north first, then his lords, then whatever remains. It is a plan built entirely upon a single assumption. The king is in the room. The wolf is in the trap. And when the musicians laid down their light tunes and took up the slow, deliberate opening chords of "The Rains of Castamere," every Frey man who knew what that song meant reached for his weapon, and every eye in the gallery turned toward the high table to find the young wolf who was not there. That absence was a crack in the foundation of the whole design. Sir Brynden Tully had never once let the wine touch his caution. The Blackfish had lived through too many feasts that ended in steel to trust the taste of hospitality, and Robb's strange warning had settled in his gut like a stone he could not swallow. He had kept his sword belt loose across his lap the entire evening. He had marked the exits. He had counted the men along the walls and noted which of them did not drink. So when the melody shifted and the first crossbowman on the upper gallery leveled his weapon, the Blackfish was already rising, already drawing, and his blade opened the man's throat before the bolt could be loosed. A second crossbowman he took through the ribs. Then the hall dissolved into chaos, and Brynden Tully seized his bleeding, bewildered nephew by the collar and began to carve a path toward the door. Now turn to the man whose hesitation would decide everything. Roose Bolton stood along the eastern wall, and Roose Bolton did the arithmetic that ambition always does. He had come to this hall to see a king die. That was the price of his betrayal, the terrible currency that would purchase him, the North and the Warden's title, and the vengeance of the Lannisters made into gold and land. But the king was absent, and Roose Bolton, whose entire life had been an exercise in never wagering more than the odds allowed, felt the ground shift beneath the careful edifice of his treason. To commit his Dreadfort men openly now, in a hall full of surviving Northmen, with the king in the north alive and unharmed beyond the walls, was to declare himself a kinslayer and oathbreaker before an enemy who still had an army. If Robb Stark lived, then Roose Bolton's name would be the first written in the ledger of the guilty. And Robb Stark lived. So he held his men back. He kept his face a pale, still mask. He let the Freys spring their half-formed trap and spend their arrows. And he calculated, in the cold ledger of his mind, that a betrayal, only half executed, might yet be disowned. It was the prudent choice. It was the survivable choice. It was also the choice that would haunt him, for a treason left incomplete earns the trust of no one and the mercy of none, and the Lannisters would not thank a man who had watched the wolf escape. Across the river, the near bank of the twins erupted. The Greatjon had not slept out of his mail, and neither had any man in Robb Stark's host. And when the horns of alarm shrieked from the castle, and the screaming carried thin across the black water, the northern army was already surging into motion. Torches bloomed along the shore. Steel came free of scabbards. And through the confusion of it all, out of a postern gate and down toward the reeds, came the Blackfish half-carrying Edmure Tully, both men soaked in blood not entirely their own, plunging into the cold current and striking out for the far side, while Frey arrows hissed into the water around them. They reached the northern bank alive, bloodied, gasping, but alive. Robb Stark came down to meet them at the water's edge, Greywind pacing at his side, and when he heard from his uncle's lips how the doors had been meant to close, how the crossbows had waited in the galleries, how the song had been chosen to mask the murder of every soul beneath that roof, the young king's face went white, and then it went terrible. He wept. Not for grief, for fury, for the nearness of the ruin he had so narrowly refused to walk into. And through his tears he made a vow, low and iron and unforgiving, that House Frey had spilled blood upon the sacred threshold of guest right, and that debt would be answered in full. What if a fortress built to control a river became, in a single night, a cage for the very man who thought himself its master? By dawn, the twins stood ringed on the western bank, and the trap that had been laid for a king had closed instead upon those who set it. Robb Stark did not storm the gates. He was not a fool, and he had learned, in the hard schooling of a war he had never lost, that patience is itself a kind of weapon. He invested the towers. He posted his outriders along every road that fed toward the crossing, and then he waited, letting the weight of his host settle over the Freys like a slow and gathering frost. Inside his war tent, the council split along the grain of grief. The Greatjon wanted blood, and he wanted it now, and he said as much with a fist upon the table that set the cups leaping. The surviving Karstarks, still raw from the execution of their lord, wanted the same. They spoke of the old Karstark dead, of oaths betrayed, of the sacred salt and bread trod underfoot, and every word they spoke was true, and every word carried the reek of men who would burn the world to warm their wounds. They did not want a siege. They wanted a reckoning. They wanted the towers thrown down, and every Frey hanged from the walls of their own castle. Catelyn counseled otherwise, and she counseled it with the cold clarity of a woman who had already lost too much to spend the rest cheaply. What Walder Frey had done was not merely a crime, she told them. It was a gift. Guest right was the one law that bound even the lawless, the one custom that no lord, however grasping, dared to name aloud that he had broken, and Walder had broken it. Publish that. Send it to every hall in the Riverlands, to every doubting house in the north that had watched the young wolf's fortunes with narrowed eyes and calculated whether to follow or to fold. Let them hear that the Freys had planned to murder guests beneath their roof, to the music of their own hired players. A castle taken by storm is a victory. A truth spread wide is a cause. She did not raise her voice. she did not need to. And while the lords argued blood against strategy, within the walls a quieter man made the calculation that would unmake him. Roose Bolton had come south to hedge, and hedging had trapped him. He had entered the twins expecting to leave them the second most powerful man in the north, his rival's throat opened by another's hand, his own hands clean. Instead, the wolf lived. Instead, the doors had never closed. And now Bolton found himself walled inside a fortress, hated by the king outside, and mistrusted by the Freys within. A man of two masters and no friend, and he did what such men always do. He reached for the stronger hand. He wrote to Tywin Lannister, careful words, bloodless words, disavowing any failure, pleading that the fault lay with Frey clumsiness and not with his own resolve, offering terms, offering himself, offering the North's back to the sword, if only Casterly Rock would forget the ruin of the plan. He gave the letter to a maester's raven and watched it climb into the gray morning sky, northeast, toward Harrenhal and the Golden Lion beyond. He believed the sky was empty. He believed, as such men do, that cleverness is a road only he can walk. The bird never crossed the river's reach. Robb's outriders had bows strung against precisely such a flight, and the raven came down in a spray of black feathers into the mud of the eastern bank, and the scroll was cut from its leg and carried across the water to the young king's hand. Robb read it once. He read it twice. Then he read it aloud, before the whole assembled host, in a voice that did not tremble, and the words fell into the silence like stones into a still pond, ring upon widening ring. Roose Bolton's mask, worn so long it had grown into the flesh, came away in a single stroke. Here was the Warden of the North they had crowned in stone and iron and trust, offering the realm's ruin to its enemy. Robb named him what he was: oathbreaker, traitor. He stripped the Dreadfort of its rights before the eyes of every lord who had ever wondered where the Pale Man's loyalty truly lay, and in doing so, he did what no siege engine could have accomplished. He gave his wavering Northmen an enemy they could hate without confusion, a betrayal so naked that even the coldest calculation could find no shelter in it. Doubt became certainty, grief became purpose, and within the twins, the seam began to split. The Freys were many, and the many are never truly one, and Walder's sons could count as well as any man. They saw a king with a righteous cause and a host that no longer wavered. They saw a father whose scheme had failed and left them all exposed upon the block. So they began, quietly, one and then another, to send their own careful ravens, not to Harrenhal, but across the water, feeling for terms, for mercy, for any thread that might keep their necks from the vengeful young wolf's blade. What holds a great house together when the head that ruled it has led it to ruin? Not love, rarely love. What holds it together is fear of the alternative. And once that fear is answered, once the sons can see a path to survival that does not run through their father's ambitions, the bonds dissolve with astonishing speed. Walder Frey had built his power upon suspicion, upon playing his children against one another, upon rewarding loyalty and punishing independence in equal measure. He had done this for so long and so well that he had forgotten the lesson every builder of such machines eventually learns. A family taught to distrust itself will, when the moment comes, betray itself with practiced ease. The siege had lasted long enough, weeks of it, and within the walls the stores had thinned and the quarrels had thickened. Grain that should have fed a garrison instead fed argument. The younger sons blamed the elder blamed the bastard branches, and all of them, quietly, in the corners where servants could not overhear, began to blame the two men who had sold them this catastrophe, Black Walder and Lothar, the clever ones. The ones who had ridden to Harrenhal and returned with Tywin Lannister's whisper in their ears, who had persuaded old Walder that guest right was a small price to pay for the golden favor of the Lannister lion. They had counseled the trap. They had promised triumph. And now they had delivered a wolf at the gate and no triumph at all. So the calculation completed itself, as such calculations do. If 2 men must die to save 80, the arithmetic is not difficult. The rival branches sent their ravens, and Robb answered, and the terms were simple. Deliver the guilty, and the innocent may live. It is a bargain older than the twins themselves, and the Freys, who understood bargains better than they understood honor, took it without much anguish. One night, the postern opened, not for escape, but for surrender. Black Walder was taken in his bed by cousins he had commanded that morning. Lothar was seized at his own table, a cup still in his hand, betrayed by the smiling faces he had trusted, because he had never imagined they possessed the courage to move against him. He had misjudged them. Fear makes cowards brave when the danger of doing nothing grows greater than the danger of acting. The twins fell without the ruinous assault Robb had dreaded. No breach, no burning, no 1,000 men bleeding upon the causeway. Only an open gate and a line of Frey nobles standing hollow-eyed in the cold, and among them, the guilty, bound. On the riverbank, Robb made his justice, and he made it grim, and he made it public, because justice hidden is no justice at all. The trident ran gray and swift behind him, the same waters that fed the crossing house Frey had grown rich guarding. Black Walder died first, and he died cursing. Lothar died second, and he died pleading, which shamed him more than the axe. And then they brought old Walder Frey to the block, 400 summers in his bones, and a lifetime of cunning gone to nothing. And Robb looked at the withered thing that had plotted to violate the most sacred law between host and guest, and he did not hesitate. The old man had schemed to spill the blood of men who ate his bread. The sentence wrote itself. The king who passes it should swing the sword. And Robb had learned that lesson at his father's knee, and so he swung it. He took hostages after Sir Perwyn Frey, who had guarded Catelyn honorably and warned against the treachery, and others of the blameless branches, taken north not as prisoners in chains, but as sureties, living reminders that the shattered house would keep its faith or watch its remaining sons pay for the failure. It was mercy and menace braided into one gesture. The Freys would endure. They would simply never again forget who held the leash. But there remained one piece still loose upon the board. Roose Bolton had not surrendered with the rest. The Lord of the Dreadfort was too careful a man to walk out into the daylight and trust himself to a young king's mercy, for he understood, better than any Frey, that his own guilt was of a different order entirely. He had not merely schemed, he had betrayed the North itself. So he did what serpents do. He tried to slip away in the gray hour before dawn, cloaked as a serving man, his pale eyes lowered, moving toward the postern gate among the kitchen folk and the stable hands, gambling that in the confusion of a fallen castle, one more shabby figure would pass unremarked. It was a good gamble. It was nearly enough. Robb's men caught him at the gate. Something in the stillness of him, the unhurried composure that no true servant ever wore, betrayed him more surely than any shouted accusation. They stripped the cloak away, and beneath it stood the Leech Lord, calm even then, calculating even then, already assembling the words that had saved him so many times before. And Robb came to look upon him, the man whose counsel of caution had once sounded so much like wisdom, the man who would have opened his throat at another man's wedding feast. Robb remembered every quiet suggestion, every measured hesitation, and understood now the shape of the mind that had offered them. He did not send Bolton to the block with the phrase, "Some deaths a king delegates." This one he kept. 600 leagues to the south, in a solar high above the tangle of King's Landing, another man was learning the shape of failure. He did not learn it slowly. Ravens do not travel slowly, and the news they carried moved through the Red Keep like a chill through old stone. Tywin Lannister read the letter twice. He read it the way he read everything, without haste, without any outward sign that the words within it had rearranged the map of the world. But something in him tightened, some cold mechanism turning over behind those pale green eyes, calculating the cost, the damage, the distance already lost. Robb Stark lived. Walder Frey was dead. Roose Bolton was dead. The instrument he had crafted so carefully, the blade meant to end the war in a single sudden stroke, had shattered in the hand that swung it, and the North remained exactly what he had labored so long to break, unbroken. He set the letter down. He did not burn it, not yet. Burning it would change nothing, and Tywin Lannister did not waste gestures on things that changed nothing. What he understood, in that first cold minute, was not merely that a battle plan had come apart. Plans came apart. Wars were made of plans coming apart. What he understood was worse, and it was this. The scheme had borne his fingerprints, and now the scheme had a survivor. Walder Frey could not talk. Roose Bolton could not talk. But dead men leave behind their letters, their ledgers, their whispered confidences to captains who lived. And every one of those threads led back through the twins to a solar in King's Landing, where an old lion had promised lands and titles in exchange for a murder committed beneath a guest banner. The most sacred protection in all the world, guest right, broken by Lannister design. That was the wound, not the men lost, the story. Because Tywin Lannister had spent 40 years building a single, priceless thing. Not gold, though he had gold. Not soldiers, though he had those too. He had built a reputation, the certainty, held by every lord from the Wall to the Broken Arm, that Tywin always won, that to stand against him was to stand against the tide itself. Men bent to that reputation before a single sword was drawn. It was worth 10,000 spears. And now, for the first time since Castamere, it had taken a wound that gold could not close. So he moved. He always moved. The first ravens flew within the hour, and they carried denials, careful denials, worded by a man who understood that a denial too loud confirms the very thing it protests. Grief for the fallen Freys, loyal bannermen struck down by treachery, condemnation of the savagery in the Riverlands. Not a word admitting knowledge, not a syllable conceding design. Let the accusation come. He would meet it with wounded dignity and the long patience of a man who had outlasted every enemy he had ever made. But denial alone would not restore what force had failed to seize. The North was still a crown upon a young man's head, and Tywin needed a claim to it, some legal thread by which a Lannister hand might one day pull it south. Force had failed. That left marriage. He sent for Tyrion. The conversation that followed was brief, and it was a thing of edges. Tywin did not raise his voice. He never needed to. He spoke of the wedding to Sansa Stark as a matter already decided, and he spoke of urgency, of moving the ceremony forward, of a son inside a Stark girl before the year was out, a grandchild with the blood of Winterfell in its veins, a claim that no battlefield could grant now. Tyrion listened, and Tyrion understood. He understood the marriage, yes, but more than that, he understood the urgency, and the urgency told him everything the denials would not. His father was afraid, not the trembling fear of common men, the cold, computing fear of a player who had glimpsed, for the first time in decades, the edge of the board, Tywin Lannister did not press a marriage this hard when he was winning. He pressed it this hard when winning had slipped from his grasp, and he was reaching, at last, for whatever remained. Disgust moved through Tyrion like cold water, and beneath the disgust, unexpectedly, something like resolve. He went to Sansa. He did not speak to her of politics. He treated her with a caution that was almost tenderness, a careful gentleness in a place that offered her none, and he did not tell her why, though he suspected she already sensed the storm gathering above them both. Far away, the story his father dreaded was already running loose. It reached the Vale, where cold lords in cold halls turned the words over and weighed them. It reached Dorne, where old grievances never truly sleep, where the name Lannister was a wound that had been bleeding for 17 years, and where the tale of guests slaughtered beneath a banner of peace was received not with horror, but with something far more dangerous: interest. In sunlit courts and shadowed keeps, men who had spent their lives fearing Tywin Lannister began, very quietly, to do a thing they had never dared before. They began to calculate, to wonder whether the lion's star, so long fixed at its zenith, had finally begun its fall. And in the Red Keep, Tywin Lannister sat alone with the letter and did the same arithmetic, and did not like the sum. What if a king who nearly died learns the shape of his own mortality and never quite forgets it? What if survival itself becomes the teacher that no victory could ever be? Robb Stark held his council in the great hall of the twins, in the very keep where the Freys had meant to butcher him. The symbolism was not lost on anyone who entered. The tables where poisoned wine might have been poured now held maps and tallies of the living. The gallery where crossbowmen might have crouched now stood empty, swept clean, silent. He had chosen this room deliberately. A man who conquers the place of his intended murder wishes it to be remembered where the murder failed. They came to him, the bannermen who remained, the houses that had bled for him and not betrayed him, filed into that hall and looked upon a king who was younger than most of their sons, and yet carried something in his bearing that had not been there before. The Great John rose first, as the Great John always rose first, and his voice filled the rafters like a war horn. He named Robb king in the north and king of the Trident, and he did not name it as flattery. He named it as fact, the way one names the sunrise. Maege Mormont followed, blunt and iron-hard, her words few and heavy. Galbart Glover after her, measured, grave. One by one the lords of the North and the Riverlands reaffirmed the crown they had first given him at Riverrun, and this time the affirmation carried a different weight, because this time they knew precisely how close they had come to affirming a corpse. Robb accepted it. He did not smile. He had learned that a king who survives an ambush does not celebrate. He calculates. He named Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, his master of war. It was not a difficult decision. The Blackfish had smelled the trap before the trap had closed, had counseled caution when caution was unfashionable, and Robb had listened, and Robb yet lived. A king remembers who saved him. A king rewards the instinct that outpaced disaster, and so the old knight who had spent a lifetime refusing lordship now took command of the king's armies, and no man in that hall objected, for every man in that hall owed his continued breathing to the Blackfish's suspicion. To Edmure he gave the northern watch of the crossing. The twins were the throat of the war now, the narrow pass through which armies must move, and Robb would not leave that throat ungoverned. Edmure took it, chastened by his own near ruin, eager to prove himself worthy of a trust that had nearly been squandered. Then came the harder council, the one held not in the great hall, but in the solar, behind a closed door, between a mother and a son. Catelyn did not waste words. What if he fell? What if the arrow that missed at the twins found its mark on some future field, and he died as his father had died, with no heir named, no son to inherit, no clear line for the North to rally behind? The North had bled to make him king. If he perished childless, that same North would tear itself apart contending for his crown, and every drop of blood already spilled would have been spilled for nothing. She had seen what ambition did to a realm without a clear succession. She had watched it consume the Seven Kingdoms. She would not watch it consume the North. Robb heard her. He did not dismiss her. He was past the age of dismissing his mother, past the arrogance that had led him to a marriage he could not undo. He promised to protect Jane Westerling. He promised to honor the vows he had made her, the vows that had cost him the Freys, the vows that had nearly cost him everything. But he would not name an heir. Not yet. Not until Winterfell was his again. Not until the North was whole and the war had turned, and he stood in the halls of his fathers with the future settled beneath his feet. Catelyn understood the reasoning. She did not accept it. A king who postpones the question of his own replacement leaves a door ajar, and doors left ajar invite the very murderers one hopes to bar. She said as much. He did not answer. He did not need to. The uncertainty lingered in the room after she left it, and it lingered in the minds of his bannermen too, who noticed that their king had a wife but no heir, a crown but no clear future beyond his own single mortal body. He was already looking outward. A wounded power that means to survive does not merely tend its wounds. It seeks allies before its enemies can gather. Robb sent envoys, quiet men on quiet roads, to the Vale and to Dorne. To the Vale first, where Lisa Arryn sat upon her mountain and refused, as Robb had half expected she would, clutching her isolation like a shield, deaf to any cause but her own son's safety. Dorne was different. Dorne listened. Prince Doran's agents received the northern envoys with the careful courtesy of men who reveal nothing and forget nothing, and they carried word back through the passes to Sunspear, word that the wolf had slipped the lion's snare and stood bloodied but unbroken in the field. And in the water gardens, beneath the laughter of children and the slow drip of fountains, a patient man who had waited 17 years read that word and began, very quietly, to move a peace he had held in reserve for a very long time. What if the news that shatters a king arrives not on the field of battle, but in a quiet room, on a scrap of paper carried by a rider who has ridden his horse half to death? The letter comes at dusk. It is stained with mud and rain, folded and refolded so many times the creases have begun to tear. And when Robb Stark breaks the seal and reads it, the young king who slipped the lion's snare, who broke the Lannister host, who married for love against all counsel and survived the reckoning, goes very still. He reads it once. He reads it again, as though the words might rearrange themselves into some gentler shape. They do not. Winterfell has fallen. Winterfell has burned. Theon Greyjoy, ward of his father, boy who grew up beside him, who trained beside him, who called him brother in all but blood, has taken the seat of the Starks by treachery and put the castle to the torch. And Bran, and Rickon. The letter says they are dead. The letter says the Ironborn hung their small bodies from the walls. He does not weep, not at first. Grief that deep does not arrive as water. It arrives as absence, as a hollowing out, as the sudden understanding that the ground on which one has stood one's entire life has been pulled away, and there is nothing beneath it but air. Consider the cruelty of the timing. Robb has won. Against every probability, against the odds that any student of the game would have quoted him, he has kept his cause, and his crown, and his life intact, where the true history saw him butchered at a wedding feast. And now, in the very hour of his survival, the war reaches around behind him and takes the thing he was fighting to protect: the North, his home, his brothers, all of it, gone in his absence, while his eyes were fixed south upon the lion. The letter, of course, is a lie. Not wholly, but in its cruelest particulars. The boys are not dead. Bran and Rickon live, hidden, fled beyond the walls before the miller's sons were murdered and burned in their place, and dressed in northern colors to end all pursuit. But Robb cannot know this. No living man near him knows it. And so he grieves for children who breathe. And he makes his decisions upon a false foundation. And this is the nature of the game: that a man may play flawlessly and still be undone by information he was never given. He resolves to march north. He says it in the solar, hands flat upon the table, voice steady in the way that costs enormous effort. He will reclaim Winterfell. He will drive the Greyjoys into the cold sea that spawned them. He will avenge his brothers. And every man in the room understands the weight of what he is saying, because to turn north is to turn away from the Lannisters, from the war he has been winning, from the throne that ordered his father's head struck from his shoulders. But here the board reveals its terrible geometry. The Boltons are destroyed, their treachery discovered and answered in the aftermath of the Frey's fall. And with House Bolton gone, there is no great power left in the north to hold it against the ironborn tide. No one to garrison the coasts, no one to bar the neck. The north lies open. And so Robb does what a commander must, which is to divide a strength that was never large enough to divide. He detaches the Umbers and the Glovers, hard northern men who ache to go home, and he sends them south and then north again, down through the riverlands and up the causeway to Moat Cailin, that ancient ruined gate that guards the only land road into the north. Retake the moat, drive Balon's raiders from the shores, save the homeland, even if it cannot be saved whole. Catelyn watches him make these choices, and her heart is a battlefield of its own. She has lost sons, or believes she has, and the grief of it nearly unmakes her. But she has daughters too, Sansa and Arya, one a hostage in King's Landing, one vanished into the dark, and she knows with a mother's terrible clarity that if Robb turns his whole strength north, if he abandons the war in the south entirely, then whatever leverage remains to win her girls back is thrown away forever. She takes his hands. She tells him he cannot forsake it all. She tells him that a king who saves his home and loses everything else has saved nothing that will last. And Robb, torn between the dead and the living, between vengeance and survival, makes the hardest choice a commander can make. He splits his cause. He sends force enough north to save the north, and he holds force enough in the Riverlands to keep the pressure on the lion. And in doing so, he thins himself dangerously across too much ground, wagering that being everywhere weakly is better than being nowhere at all. It is the choice of a man who has too few pieces and too many things to protect. It keeps him alive. It keeps him fighting. It also means that when the next blow comes, and blows always come, he will meet it stretched thin, his strength scattered, from the neck to the trident, his eyes pulled in 3 directions at once. And far to the south, in a garden of fountains and children's laughter, the patient man is already moving. What if the loudest man in the realm died at the height of his own triumph, and the sound of his choking carried farther than any war horn? In King's Landing, the wedding is a spectacle built to declare that the Lannister-Tyrell alliance is eternal, that the throne is secure, that the war in the West is a matter of cleanup and not of survival. Joffrey Baratheon weds Margaery Tyrell beneath the Great Sept, and the city is meant to see in it the marriage of a proud golden house to the richest bloom in the reach. The feast that follows is enormous, obscene in its abundance, a display of wealth the crown does not actually possess, and money it has borrowed against futures it cannot promise. 77 courses, a boy king strutting among them, and then, in the space of a single swallow, the boy who ordered Ned Stark's head, struck from his shoulders, clutches at his own throat, his face darkening from pink to purple, his eyes bulging, his mother screaming, and in moments, the most feared name in Westeros is a corpse on the floor of his own hall. He dies, as his enemies dreamed he would die. He does not die by any Stark hand. The chaos is immediate, and chaos, as always, is a knife with no loyal owner. Cersei Lannister, drowning in grief and fury, wants a culprit that instant, and her eyes fall where they always fall, on Tyrion, the brother she hates, the dwarf who served the wine, the imp she has wanted broken for a lifetime. He is seized. He is accused of poisoning a king, and in the confusion of that seizure, in the moment, every eye is fixed upon the dead boy and the living scapegoat. Another piece slides quietly off the board entirely. Sansa Stark vanishes. Consider what she was worth. She was the last Stark in Lannister hands, the daughter Tywin meant to marry to Tyrion and hold as a leash, the hostage whose life could be dangled before Robb to bend his terms, the key to the north he intended to turn at the moment of maximum leverage. She was, in the cold arithmetic of the game, a fortune in flesh, and in the span of a screaming feast she is spirited through a side door, out of the Red Keep, onto a waiting ship, by a man who has spent years arranging precisely this, a man of small stature and smaller mercy, a man who trades in chaos the way merchants trade in silk. Petyr Baelish takes her, and Tywin Lannister wakes the next morning to find that the hand he meant to hold against his enemy's throat is empty. He does not rage. Tywin Lannister does not rage where others can see, but he understands the size of what has been taken from him, and it is enormous. Far to the north, the news travels as such news does, distorted and delayed, arriving in Robb Stark's stretched and scattered camp as rumor first and confirmation later. The young wolf hears that Joffrey is dead, and it stirs no joy in him worth the name, because he learned long ago that a dead enemy is only ever replaced by a younger one. But he hears something else in the same breath, something that makes him rise from his chair before the messenger has finished speaking. Sansa is gone, not dead, gone, slipped out of the capital, out of Lannister reach, out of the trap they built for her. One sibling lives. One sibling is beyond the lion's paw. It is the first good news he has had that did not arrive soaked in someone's blood. He sends riders that same night. He sends them south, along roads he cannot travel himself, into a country still crawling with enemies, with instructions to find any trace of her, any whisper, any thread. He knows the odds. A girl vanished into a realm this vast is a needle in a burning field, and the man who took her, if it was a man and not mere fortune, is a shadow no one can follow. But Robb cannot not look. She is his sister. She is his mother's daughter. She is the living proof that the war has not devoured everything he loved, and he will spend riders he can barely spare to chase even the ghost of her. And he curses. He curses the ground between them, the leagues he cannot cross, the fact that he is pinned here in the middle of everything he is trying to protect and can reach none of it. He is a king who cannot ride to his own sister, but something is shifting in the south, and Robb, stretched thin and desperate as he is, will come to feel the loosening of it. Tywin's alliance, so unbreakable a season ago, begins to strain. There is a new boy on the throne now, Tommen, gentle where his brother was cruel, malleable where his brother was mad, and around that softness, the Tyrells begin to circle. Marjorie is a widow before she was truly a wife, and a widow with a claim to the next king is a dangerous flower indeed. The crown's debts mount, the Iron Bank watches, and Tywin, who should be marshalling every resource to crush the broken wolf in the north, finds his attention pulled inward, toward the rot at the center of his own house. The lion is distracted. The wolf, thinly stretched and bleeding, is not yet dead, and in that narrow gap between two ruined strengths, Robb begins, quietly, to consolidate what remains. What if the road home was never truly closed, only held shut by a hand that could be broken? The neck is a country of water and reed and rot, a green wound running across the base of the north, and at its heart sits Moat Cailin, 3 broken towers of black basalt older than the Andals, a choke point so absolute that no army in 10,000 years has forced it from the south and lived to boast of it. The Ironborn hold it now, a garrison of Balon Greyjoy's men, salt-stained and diminished, squats in the ruins believing themselves the cork in the bottle, believing that so long as they hold this crossing, the wolves cannot come home. They are correct about the geography. They are wrong about the direction, because the threat does not come from the south. It comes from both sides at once. The Umbers descend from the north, out of the last stretch of solid ground before the causeway begins, and the Glovers press up from below with the mountain clans strung between them like beads on a wire. Wolves and Norries and Littles, who have followed House Stark since before there was a 7 Kingdoms, to follow anyone into. The Ironborn are built to raid, to strike and vanish, and strike again from the water. They are not built to be surrounded on land they cannot flee. When the assault comes in the gray hour before dawn, from north and south in the same breath, the garrison finds itself pressed between 2 hosts that do not tire, and do not treat, and do not forgive. The towers fall one by one. By midday the cork is pulled, and the road home stands open for the first time in a year of war. Robb's forerunners ride north through the reopened neck, and what they find at the end of it does not look like a homecoming. Winterfell is a ruin of blackened stone and fallen timber, its towers gutted, its godswood scorched at the edges, snow drifting through halls that once held 10,000 years of warmth. The castle burned, and the small folk scattered into the winter town and the woods beyond. And it would be easy, standing in that wreckage, to read the whole story off the walls, and grieve it and move on. But the forerunners do not move on. They speak to the survivors, and the survivors tell them something that does not fit the story the walls are telling. No one saw the boys' bodies. The bannermen who came after the sack, Bolton men, before the Boltons broke, hung 2 corpses from the walls and called them the sons of Eddard Stark, but the corpses were small and burned and tarred beyond knowing, and the miller's boys had gone missing that same season, and the Cranogmen, who had been fostering at the castle, vanished with a fat boy and a witless one into the Wolf's Wood and was never found. It is a rumor. It is smoke. It is precisely the kind of thing that a desperate man should not let himself believe, because hope is a knife that cuts the hand that grips it, and Robb Stark has bled enough already. When word reaches him, he does not weep, and he does not celebrate. He goes very still, the way he goes still before a battle, and he turns the rumor over, the way a man turns a coin he suspects is counterfeit. Bran and Rickon may be dead. They very probably are dead, but probably is not certainly, and certainly was the word he thought he had. He does not tell his lords to search. Not yet. To announce a hope is to make it a promise, and a king cannot afford promises he may have to break. So he holds it inside himself, this small, cold ember, and he says nothing, and he rides on. He rides to White Harbor, because a king who has lost his seat must build another, and there is only one place in the north with walls that did not burn, and coffers that did not empty, and a lord who has waited all this while for exactly this moment. Wyman Manderley is fat and old and slow of foot, and none of that matters, because Wyman Manderley is rich. His city sits on the mouth of the White Knife, a stone port of the New Gods, and he has ships, real ships, war galleys, and gold enough to build more, and a hatred of the Freys and Lannisters that has been aging in his cellars like a fine dark wine, waiting only for a cup worthy of it. When Robb comes to him, Manderley does not hesitate. The Boltons are gone. The board has cleared. He kneels his considerable weight before the king in the north and pledges his full strength, his gold, his galleys, his men-at-arms in their green and white. And for the first time in the entire war, Robb Stark possesses something he has never had: a fortified base that cannot be easily taken, a fleet, a seat of power with walls and water and wealth behind it. The wolf, so long a creature of the open field, of tents and mud and marching, now has a den of stone. And within those walls, as the maps are unrolled across Manderley's great table, and the first war galleys are counted in the harbor below, Robb turns his cold ember over once more in the dark of his mind, and begins, at last, to wonder what he might dare to hope. What if the greatest strategist of his age could see the whole board perfectly, every piece, every threat, every opening, and still miss the one square directly beneath his own hand? Far to the south, in a city that has already begun to rot from the inside, Tywin Lannister sits in the Tower of the Hand, and he is doing what he has always done. He is calculating. He is salvaging. The Frey Bolton design has failed in the north, and though the details reach him slowly and in fragments, he understands the shape of the disaster well enough. Guest right has been broken, or nearly broken, or is whispered to have been broken, and the distinction hardly matters now, because in the minds of men, a whisper and a truth wear the same face. Houses that once feared the Lannister name now speak of the Lannisters as men who feast their guests and then murder them, and Tywin knows precisely how corrosive such a reputation becomes. It cannot be met with a sword. It cannot be answered with gold. It can only be outlasted, and to outlast it, he must restore the appearance of order swiftly, cleanly, before his enemies learn to exploit the crack. And so he turns to the matter of his son. Joffrey is dead, poisoned at his own wedding, choking purple before a hall full of witnesses, and the accusation has landed upon Tyrion, the dwarf, the disappointment, the son Tywin has spent a lifetime resenting for the crime of being born. The trial must be conducted, and conducted properly, with all the machinery of justice grinding in full view, so that the realm might see that even a Lannister answers for kingslaying, that the law endures even when the crown wavers. It is, in its way, a sound strategy. It is the correct strategy, and it rests entirely upon a single assumption that Tywin has held so long he no longer questions it. He assumes that Tyrion is already broken. He looks at his younger son and sees a piece already removed from the board, a man condemned, a man whose fate is sealed, a man who will play his role in the great performance of Lannister justice, and then die quietly and be forgotten. He does not consider that a cornered man is the most dangerous creature alive. He does not consider that a lifetime of contempt has taught Tyrion exactly how little his father sees him. He weighs his son as one weighs a spent coin, and in that single misjudgment, the only true blindness in a mind otherwise flawless, the old lion sets the trap for himself. Tyrion escapes his cell. The particulars unfold as they always have: a brother's guilt, a passage through hidden ways, a crossbow taken up in the dark. He climbs the stair of the Tower of the Hand, and he finds his father where a lifetime of duty has placed him, not enthroned, not armored, but seated in a place of quiet vulnerability, the mightiest man in Westeros, reduced to something small and startled in the gloom. The words between them are old wounds reopened, accusations, denials, the ancient and unhealed grievances of a family that has poisoned itself for decades. And then the bolt is loosed, and Tywin Lannister, who broke the Reign and the Tarbeck, who ruled a realm from behind 3 kings, who authored victory upon victory across a lifetime, dies not as the architect of triumph, but as a statesman watching, in his final breath, the greatest strategy of his life collapse into ruin. He dies knowing. That is the cruelty of it. He dies understanding precisely what his death will unleash, because Tywin was the last restraint. Without him, the machinery he built has no hand upon the levers, and the woman who inherits his power has none of his discipline. Cersei Lannister, freed of her father's shadow, does not consolidate. She fractures. She looks upon the Tyrells, the very allies whose swords and grain keep the crown standing, and sees rivals to be undermined rather than partners to be managed. She looks upon the faith, that ancient sleeping power, and imagines she can wake it and wield it and set it back to sleep at her pleasure. She arms the faith militant. She empowers zealots. She mistakes suspicion for strategy and paranoia for foresight. And one careful decision at a time, she dismantles the coalition her father spent his life assembling. King's Landing turns inward. Faction devours faction. The Iron Throne, which not a season ago loomed over the continent as an engine of relentless pressure, becomes a court consumed by its own quarrels, paralyzed at the precise moment it can least afford to be. And in the north, the wolf smells the change in the wind. Robb Stark, secure now behind the walls of White Harbor, with Manderley's galleys in his harbor and Manderley's gold in his coffers, reads the reports of southern chaos not with joy, but with the cold, deliberate attention of a man who has learned patience the hard way. The pressure on the riverlands is easing. Western garrisons, once fed and reinforced by a crown that no longer looks their way, begin to feel the hunger of neglect. He summons the blackfish, he unrolls the maps, and he understands, with the clarity of a hunter who has waited long in the cold, that the moment to close his hand has finally, at last, arrived. But before the hand closes, something arrives that the maps did not account for. It comes not through Raven, nor through the polished channels of Manderley's spy network, but through the crannogmen of the Neck, those silent watchers of the black water and the drowned roads who trust no message they have not carried themselves. A rider slips into White Harbor unannounced, mud to the knee, and asks only to speak to the king in private. What he carries is not intelligence about Lannister troop movements or Frey grain stores. It is a word Robb Stark has not dared to speak aloud in longer than he can remember. The word is a name, 2 names. Bran lives. Rickon lives. Consider the arithmetic Robb has lived by for a year. 2 brothers dead, or so the world believed, their small bodies burned above the gates of Winterfell by a man who wore Stark trust like a stolen cloak. He had folded that grief into his war, the way a smith folds ruined iron back into the fire, letting it harden him, letting it sharpen every decision. He had made peace with being, in the eyes of the North, the last true wolf. And now, in a single sentence delivered by a man reeking of the swamps, the arithmetic breaks. The dead are not dead. The line is not ended. The war he has fought as vengeance becomes, in the space of one breath, a war for something living. He does not weep, not yet. He is too careful for that, too aware of the men beyond the door. He asks his questions like a commander interrogating a scout, because that is the only way he knows to hold himself upright. Where? How certain? The Crannogman answers plainly. Bran is beyond the wall, carried north by companions. Robb does not know and cannot reach, chasing purposes the boy himself may not understand. That one is lost to him for now, a piece removed from the board by geography and mystery both. But Rickon is close. Rickon was taken to Skagos, that grim stone island of unicorns and cannibal rumor, and Skagos can be sailed to. Skagos can be answered. So Robb does what a king does. He converts revelation into instruction. He summons the men he trusts most, not the loudest of his bannermen, but the surest, and he sends them south and east with Manderly's ships and Manderly's gold, with orders as simple as they are absolute. Find the boy, bring him home, guard him as you would guard the crown itself, because in every way that matters, that is what he now is. Robb has no wife safely with child, no acknowledged heir of his body, only a war and a name and a future that has, until this hour, extended no further than his own life. Rickon changes that. Rickon gives the North a tomorrow it can hold in its hands. The waiting is its own kind of siege. Weeks pass, the southern chaos deepens, and Robb attends to it because he must. But half his mind is always on the water, always on the gray horizon beyond the harbor mouth. And then the galleys come, Manderly's men, salt-crusted and weary, and among them a small wild thing of a boy, dark-haired where his brothers ran auburn, feral from too long among strangers, a great black direwolf pressed to his side like a second shadow. And here, at last, the careful king breaks. He does not care that his lords are watching. He crosses the yard of the wolf's den, not as a monarch, but as a brother, and he goes down onto his knees in the wet stone so that his eyes are level with a child who does not, at first, know him. He says the boy's name. He says it again, and when recognition finally dawns in those small, suspicious eyes, when Rickon closes the distance and buries his face in his brother's neck, Robb Stark weeps openly, without shame, in front of every man who has followed him into this war. Great John Umber turns his head away. Old Manderly's cheeks shine wet in the torchlight, because they understand what they are witnessing. They have bled for a cause of grief and grievance. Now, kneeling in the mud with a lost child in his arms, that cause becomes something no gold can buy and no oath can counterfeit. It becomes a family, restored. It becomes a house, reborn. Robb does not let the moment stay private. He is too shrewd for that, and too honest. Within days he stands before his assembled bannermen and does the thing that no Bolton bargain and no Frey coin could ever purchase. He names Rickon Stark his heir, should he himself fall before the war is won and his own line secured. He declares before every witness that the succession of the North is settled, that the wolf line endures, that Winterfell, black and broken though it stands, will be rebuilt stone upon stone by Stark hands. He sends the word North on 100 wings, and the North answers. It answers the way loyalty answers, when it has waited a lifetime to be believed. Houses that had grown quiet stir. Mountains that had held their breath exhale into fury. The reborn Stark line becomes a fire, and every hearth in the north turns toward it. He unrolls the maps once more. This time, his hand does not tremble. What if the sharpest blade a king could wield was not a sword at all, but the exhaustion of his enemy? Robb Stark understands this now in a way he did not a year ago. He has learned that wars are not always won on the field. Sometimes they are won in the silence after the field, when both armies bleed, and only one can afford to keep bleeding. And in the south, King's Landing cannot afford anything anymore. The reports come north in fragments, and each fragment is a gift. The faith has risen. The sparrows fill the streets like a tide that will not recede, and the crown that once dictated to the seven now finds itself dictated to. The gold is gone. The Tyrells and the Lannisters, once allies of convenience, circle each other with the wary hatred of two creditors owed by the same bankrupt house. Robb reads it all, and he does the arithmetic that only a man who has learned patience can do. He counts the fronts the Regency can fight. He arrives at a number. That number is not 2. So he does not march. He sends men instead. The Blackfish rides as one envoy, and beside him rolls the vast, deliberate bulk of Wyman Manderly, the Lord of White Harbor, whose smile hides a mind that never stops weighing. They carry no army. They carry terms, and terms, delivered to a crown that has run out of everything but pride, are a weapon more precise than any host Robb could assemble. He instructs them carefully. Ask for everything. Recognition of the North as a sovereign kingdom. Recognition of the Riverlands under Stark protection. The border drawn at the neck and along the trident. Ratified in ink and sealed in wax before the whole realm. Ask for it, and do not flinch, because a man who flinches at the table has already lost the war he came to end. In the Red Keep, the demands land like a slap. Kevan Lannister reads them and sets them down with the weariness of a man who has buried too much of his family. The Tyrells rage. There are men on that council who would sooner burn the parchment than let a Stark call himself king, and they say so, loudly, for weeks. The debate coils through the small council chamber like smoke that will not clear. To grant the North its freedom is to admit that the Iron Throne has failed, that a rebellion has not been crushed but conceded to, that the map of the 7 kingdoms is now a map of the 6. It is unthinkable. It is intolerable. It is, they insist, impossible. And then, one by one, they run the arithmetic that Robb ran months before. The faith cannot be fought, and the North both. The coffers cannot fund one campaign, let alone 2. The Tyrell wheat feeds the capital only so long as the Tyrells consent, and their consent has grown expensive. Every argument against peace collapses under the weight of the single fact that no one at that table can escape. They cannot win, they can only prolong, and prolonging costs coin they do not have, and men they cannot spare, and a stability the sparrows are eager to devour. Kevan Lannister is not a proud man. He is a practical one, and practicality, in the end, is what signs the parchment. He does not call it a triumph. He calls it what it is, a bleeding stanched by amputation. The North is lost. The trident is lost. Better to lose them cleanly, on paper, than to lose the crown entirely trying to hold what cannot be held. He sets his seal. The others follow, some with fury, some with resignation, all with the hollow understanding that the realm they served has grown smaller in their hands. A king is acknowledged in the North, in all but the phrasing that would let the throne save face. Robb Stark, sovereign. His enemies could not defeat him, so they let him go. The ratification comes at White Harbor in the Great Hall of the Merman's Court, where the painted walls gleam and the lords of the North and the Riverlands gather to witness what their fathers never dreamed to see. Robb signs. He does not smile the way a boy would smile. He signs the way a man signs who understands that the war he has won has only cleared the ground for the labor that follows. Peace is not the end of struggle. It is the beginning of a different, slower struggle, one measured not in battles but in seasons, in seed and stone, and the mending of what was torn. And with the ink drying, he turns at last to the thing he has held quietly in the back of his mind through every council and every campaign. Sansa. The word comes to him through careful channels, whispers threaded down from the veil, a girl hidden behind another name in the cold shadow of the Eyrie. He cannot storm those mountains. He will not, but peace has bought him something war never could: the freedom to reach without an army, to send men who ask instead of men who kill. He summons the Blackfish once more. He speaks his sister's name, and in the ruin of a shattered, sovereign realm, he begins, quietly, to plan the recovery of the last thing the war took from him. What is a king without the men who followed him into the dark? This is the question that haunts the northern lords through the last long winter of the war, and it is the question Robb Stark answers, not with a sword, but with a promise. He gathers them in the great hall of Winterfell, its roof half rebuilt, the scent of fresh-cut timber sharp in the cold air, and he does not ask them to forgive the marriage that once cracked his cause in two. He asks them only to consider what remains. The Westerling girl, gentle and quiet, sits beside him. There is no armor in her, no politics, only a woman who kept faith with a man who kept faith with her. And Robb, who has learned to think in generations rather than seasons, lays the matter before his lords as a merchant lays coin upon a table. The succession is the thing they fear, and so the succession is the thing he secures. Rickon lives. Rickon is a Stark, true-born and northern-born, and behind Rickon stand whatever children Robb and Jane may yet bring into a world grown briefly quiet. The bloodline does not end. The direwolf does not die. And when the Great John rises, red-faced and roaring as ever, it is not to protest but to laugh, because a lord who has buried sons at war knows the worth of a line that endures. The lords bend, not to the marriage, to the future the marriage no longer threatens. But they extract something in return, and Robb, who understands that every piece is a bargain, does not resist it. The North has learned a lesson, written in the blood the Freys spilled in intention, if not in fact. The lesson that Southern promises are chains dressed as garlands. And so a law is made, spoken aloud and carved into the record of the realm. No Stark shall wed south of the neck without the leave of the assembled council. Never again will a king of the North bind his house to a stranger's ambition on the strength of his own desire alone. It is a hard law. It is a cold law. It is precisely the kind of law that a people betrayed will make. And Robb signs it, knowing that in binding his own descendants, he has bound them safely, that the vigilance which once felt like cowardice at the twins has become the founding principle of a kingdom. Consider what this means. The very caution that saved his life, the instinct that turned him away from Walder Frey's table, is no longer a private virtue hidden in the heart of one wary king. It is now the law of the land. The North has taken the shape of the man who survived it. And so the slow labor begins. The Riverlands settle into an uneasy but genuine peace. Edmure restored to Riverrun, the Blackfish riding the borders like an old gray wolf keeping the fences whole. Winterfell rises stone by stone from the wound the Ironborn left in it, and Robb walks its passages not as a conqueror surveying spoils, but as a farmer walking his fields after a storm, counting what survived, planning what to plant. He restores the ancient offices that generations of Starks had let fall into disuse: the wardens of the barrows, the keepers of the Wolfswood, the old northern order that the southern kings had never understood. He rewards the houses that stood firm when standing firm meant death: Mormont, Manderley, Glover and Karstark's chastened remnant. Umber loudest of all, he builds roads where there were only tracks, men's villages burned in the fighting, sends grain north against the coming cold. It is unglamorous work. It is the only work that matters. The realm watches from the south with something between resentment and wonder. A king who was supposed to fall did not fall. A cause that was supposed to shatter at a wedding feast instead hardened into a nation. The maesters who record such things note the strangeness of it, how a single decision, a single refusal to sit at a treacherous table, unspooled into an independent kingdom that would outlast the men who doubted it. The final gathering comes in the rebuilt Godswood, beneath the ancient heart tree whose red leaves have watched 1,000 years of stark oaths. Catelyn stands there, older now, worn thin by grief that never fully came but hovered close, a woman who nearly lost everything, and instead kept most of it. Rickon at her side, wild-eyed and northern to the bone. The bannermen ringed round in the cold, and beyond them the small folk, the people who refused to let the North die when dying would have been easier. Robb stands before the weirwood and looks upon them, and upon the carved and living memory of every Stark who came before, the family history that came within a hair's breadth of ending in a stranger's hall. He speaks his oath simply. No southern promise, he swears, will ever again outweigh northern vigilance. The direwolf banners rise above the towers, gray on white, snapping in the wind that comes down cold and clean from beyond the wall. And the realm, in the fullness of years, remembers him not as the young wolf who fell to treachery in a distant hall, but as the king who survived history itself, who took the very edge of annihilation and forged from it something lasting, something free, a kingdom of the North that endured because its king had learned, once, to be afraid, and had made of that fear a wisdom that outlived them all. And this brings us to the end of this alternate history. If you enjoyed exploring how events might have unfolded differently, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. We dive into new stories from the world of Westeros every single day, imagining the choices, battles, alliances, and destinies that could have completely changed the fate of the Seven Kingdoms. And if you'd like to explore even more stories, our Lorekeeper members unlock a brand new exclusive alternate history every single week. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. What do you think would have happened next? Did this version of history end better than the original? Or would you have taken the story in a completely different direction? Leave your ideas in the comments, because many of the best future stories come directly from your suggestions. Thank you so much for watching and for spending your time with me. I'll see you tomorrow with another alternate history from Westeros. Until then, peace out.